Nothing any worse than not being able to hear. Well, I'm glad to be here. My name is David Ragan, and my first time ever at Park Manor. Had no idea where it was until Miss Ethel led me over here today. So I'm glad to be here. Grew up here in Nashville. Been here my entire life, and currently working at Travelers Rest, the home of John Overton, historic site, the oldest historic house open to the public in Davidson County. It was built in 1799. So I'm what they call the senior interpreter, which is a fancy title for a tour guide or a docent, whatever you'd like to call it. But anyhow, there'll be a time today, folks, when I'm finished with my talk, unless you guys run me out of here early, that you'll be able to ask questions, and I'll answer them the best I can. And for the questions that I don't know the answer to, you're going to get this. I'm sorry, I don't know. I don't believe in making things up that sound good. So anyhow, we're glad that you folks came over here today to listen to what we're going to talk about. Let me introduce a couple of ladies to you. You may or may not know Miss Ethel Hollis. She's a co-worker of mine at Travelers Rest. And my lovely little angel wife, Miss Michelle, is here today. So I'm very honored to have them here to support me today. We're going to talk about the Civil War, and basically we're going to talk about the role of the Battle of Nashville, somewhat of the role of Travelers Rest for the Battle of Nashville, and mostly from about what happened here in this area of Middle Tennessee from February of 1862 until the day after Christmas of 1864, which was the vital part of the Middle Tennessee campaign of the Civil War. Of course, the Civil War is known as the Civil War, the War of Northern Aggression, the Great American Civil War. It's had many different titles, the War Between the States. So whatever you want to call it, all of those titles have been given to it, and they are somewhat appropriate. 1861 to 1865. If you're not aware of this, Tennessee was the last state to secede from the Union, and the first state to be readmitted. The first time the vote was taken to secede or remain loyal with the Union, Tennessee remained loyal with the Union. The second vote, however, convinced them to secede and become a part of the Confederacy. So, Travelers Rest's role at this time was John Overton Jr. and his second wife, Harriet Maxwell Overton, were both supporters of the Union. John Jr. did not want to be a part of another government that would separate from the United States of America. That's how he felt about it in the beginning. But when the vote to secede finally occurred, he could not go against his native state, and he chose to be a Southern supporter. In fact, he would support the Confederacy out of his wealthy back pocket to the point where he would be given the title of Honorary Colonel of Militia by the Governor of Tennessee, Isham Harris. So from that point forward, he would be known as Colonel Overton. Now, don't let that confuse you with a soldier who would have the rank of colonel. He never served as a soldier. He was simply given the title of colonel. However, he did ride with the Confederate Army of Tennessee twice. We'll talk about his part of the Army of Tennessee a little later, but he actually was with the Army of Tennessee April the 6th and 7th, 1862, at the Battle of Shiloh. Again, not serving as a soldier, but more or less as a supporter out of his wealthy back pocket, and to ride and be an advisor to some of the men who fought with Albert Sidney Johnston during that time period. If you're not familiar with Fort Donelson and Fort Henry, they're near Dover, Tennessee, and the Federal Army captured Fort Donelson and Fort Henry in February of 1862. And after these two forts were surrendered to the Federal Army, word spread like wildfire here in Nashville that the Yankees are on their way. Now, at that time, ladies and gentlemen, the city of Nashville was very lightly defended by Confederates. So, when the Federal Army would arrive here in the latter part of February of 1862, they had no problem taking the city of Nashville over. In fact, the mayor of our city gladly gave the city of Nashville to the Federal Army because of this. He actually rode across the Cumberland River to see the overall Federal commander at that time, and the first time he went over there, they weren't there. So he came back, went back the second time, and actually surrendered the city. Now, just prior to this, the city was in such a state of panic, the spectators were just in a terrible commotion, and they actually had to bring in General Nathan Bedford Forrest to restore order and turn this into somewhat of an organized retreat by a lot of citizens, and many of those who chose to stay here were absolutely scared to death that the Federal Army was going to come in here and take over the city of Nashville. And as I said, they did in February of 1862. About a month later to be our 17th President of the United States, Andrew Johnson would arrive. He was the military governor of Tennessee at that time. He was so impressed with the federal occupation of the city, he decided to stay here. Our Capitol building had been turned into a federal camp, and to mock the Confederacy a little bit further, they renamed our Capitol building Fort Andrew Johnson. You can imagine that. So that's the condition of the city of Nashville in February and March of 1862. Andrew Johnson also decided he would arrest wealthy Confederate sympathizers. And who do you think one of them was? Colonel Overton. To keep from being arrested, Colonel Overton would leave Travelers Rest. And for the next year and a half, he would manage to stay hidden. He would not come back to his home to prevent being arrested. This left Travelers Rest to be managed by three ladies. They were known as the Maxwell sisters. And most of you have probably heard of the Maxwell House Hotel. And the Maxwell House Hotel has a connection with Travelers Rest, the Battle of Nashville, and possibly even Maxwell House Coffee. That's a story that a lot of folks have kind of got mixed up a little bit. But generally in 1859, 2 years before the war broke out, John Overton Jr. began construction on the original Maxwell House Hotel in downtown Nashville. How did it get its name? He named it after his second wife's maiden name, Harriet Maxwell Overton. When the Civil War broke out, the Maxwell House Hotel was still under construction. The Confederates took possession of it and turned it into what we call Zollicoffer Barracks, named after General Felix Zollicoffer, who was killed pretty early in the war by riding into somewhat of a bad position and got killed without actually any warning to it. When the war broke out and the Federal Army arrived here in Nashville and captured the city, they took possession of the Maxwell House Hotel, turned it into a federal prison and hospital, and it was still not completed. They would have this until the end of the war. Finally, when the war ended, Colonel Overton would again have the Maxwell House Hotel again, and it would be finally completed in 1869. It took 10 years for the Maxwell House Hotel to be completed from the time the first construction on it began. We talked about the Maxwell ladies. Harriet Maxwell Overton, Annie Maxwell Claiborne, and Mary Maxwell. Now these ladies all ran Travelers Rest from the spring of 1862 until the Colonel would return in February of 1865. And they had about 80 mouths to feed at this plantation. Very, very difficult times. many slaves there, as well as the people who were staying there also. In fact, Annie Maxwell Claiborne actually went to a Yankee general named General Granger. You may have heard of Fort Granger in Franklin, Tennessee. It was named after him, asking for help. And he actually did supply her with some of the things that the people needed at Travelers Rest. So there was not complete hostility, and a lot of times there was some generosity and understanding between the federal occupation of Nashville and even Confederate sympathizers. And of course, if you had Travelers Rest money, it probably made a little bit of a difference too. Now we'll fast forward a little bit and we'll talk about November the 21st, 1864. Now this date is known as the first day of Hood's Army of Tennessee campaign and invasion into the state. Hood was given the title of overall commander of the Army of Tennessee in the summer and into the fall of 1864 during the Battle of Atlanta campaign. He took the place of General Joseph E. Johnston, who was considered by Jefferson Davis too slow, too defensive, not aggressive enough. So he replaced Joseph E. Johnston with John Bell Hood. They're personal friends. Hood has a reputation of being very aggressive, and early in the war he was very successful. In fact, he was a division commander in the Army of Northern Virginia under the famous Robert E. Lee. However, it was at a cost. Devil's Den, July the 2nd, 1863, second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. John Bell Hood was wounded in the left arm, and for the rest of his life, that arm hung limp, just like this. He was withered and useless. 2 months later, at the Battle of Chickamauga with the Army of Tennessee in September of 1863, Hood was wounded in the right leg. The wound was so severe, they amputated his leg 4 inches below the hip. He was in constant pain for the rest of his life. He would only be 33 years old when he was given command of the Army of Tennessee for the Atlanta campaign. Of course, we know what happened at Atlanta. The Yankees captured Atlanta. They set the town on fire. General Sherman had done a real number on the state of Georgia. And at the time he was cutting his swath through Georgia in what he called Make Georgia Howl, John Bell Hood was beginning his plan to retake the city of Nashville. And we're getting very late in the war, folks. Very late. This is November of 1864. So, on the 21st day of November, Hood and his army left Florence, Alabama, with the great goal of retaking the city of Nashville. Hopefully then they could retake Louisville, retake Cincinnati, turn east and link up with the Army of Northern Virginia. This was Hood's ultimate goal, and it was going to be a very, very desperate attempt. When Hood came into this state, he had 38,000 men. The Army of Tennessee was still a very strong force of men. Now, as we said earlier, the Yankees had occupied this city ever since February of 1862. They had a large amount of men. However, not nearly as many men as John Bell Hood had at this time. My personal opinion, there were probably about 15 to 20,000 federal soldiers in Nashville on November the 21st of 1864. The overall commander for the Federal Army at this time was known as Old Pap, George Henry Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, a brilliant overall commander, and someone who General Sherman and Ulysses S. Grant were very jealous of because he had been successful in most of his campaigns. Hood recognized that the Federal Army was probably a little weaker than they would like to be. He felt like speed was his greatest ally. If he could reach the Yankees before they would receive further reinforcements, it would probably be to his benefit. And of course, the Federal Army realized that Hood was coming to Tennessee to retake the city of Nashville. So they began making preparations to build their defenses, to build their force in numbers. As a matter of fact, on November the 30th, 1864, when the Battle of Franklin was going on, A.J. Smith's 12,000-man force came in to support the Federal Army here in Nashville. So by the time the Battle of Nashville would finally get underway, folks, on December the 15th, the Federal Army would have 60,000 to 70,000 men here at Nashville. Well equipped, well supplied, and well fed. And later on we'll talk about how many men John Bell Hood actually had when he and his men finally arrived in Nashville. When the Army of Tennessee arrived here, they pursued the Federal Army, who had been divided a little bit. George Thomas sent a fellow named John McAllister Schofield to intercept John Bell Hood and the Army of Tennessee. The Army of Tennessee would arrive in Columbia in November of 1864, and it appeared that he had Schofield's men trapped. On the 29th day of November of 1864, John Schofield's men would meet up with the Army of Tennessee under John Bell Hood at a little place called Spring Hill. Now, as nightfall approached, no one had won this fight. However, it appeared that the Army of Tennessee had Schofield's 20,000 men trapped to the point where they could not leave and make it to Nashville, Tennessee. So around 3 o'clock in the morning, with Confederate campfires about 200 yards away, somehow, and everyone in the world has been blamed for this, from Nathan Bedford Forrest to Benjamin Franklin Cheatham to John Bell Hood, 20,000 Federal soldiers escaped during the night, undetected, and the next morning when Hood woke up and realized what happened, he was said to have been wrathy as a rattlesnake. He blamed everybody on the escape of the Federal Army at Spring Hill. He and the Army of Tennessee would pursue the Yankees even further to Franklin. And on November the 30th, 1864, the Battle of Franklin would occur. And it has been much, much publicized. In fact, many times people think nothing happened after Franklin, which I disagree with, and we'll talk a little bit about the Battle of Nashville, and you'll be reminded that it wasn't over after Franklin. John Bell Hood had, as we said, about 38,000 men when he entered the state of Tennessee. How many did he have when he attacked Schofield's force at Franklin? It's argued. It's very much argued. I think that some Confederate soldiers had deserted already between Franklin and between Spring Hill and Franklin, his force would have been smaller than 38,000 men. I think at that time we're looking at more like about 30,000 probably. The Federal Army were severely outnumbered, but they were very well entrenched. They had a good defensive position. It had been bolstered up and further strengthened. And much to everybody's surprise, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 20,000 Confederate soldiers would march across 2 miles of open fields and attack the Federal position. Many of Hood's generals argued it. Benjamin Franklin Cheatham, one of his corps commanders, said, "I don't like the looks of this." Nathan Bedford Forrest argued that if you'll let me flank them, I can flank them out in 2 hours. But Hood would have no part of it. He said, "We will make the attack, and it will be a frontal assault." We all know what happened. My wife's got to change the battery in the camera. Is that okay, folks?